Welcome, Tammy from Ohio, and others feel free to continue using the chat. We'll use it throughout our session today. But Ken, I think we should jump in. We just have an hour together and we don't want to waste a minute. So go ahead and take it away.
Well, thanks so much to the Aurora Institute for having us participate in their great conference. And thanks all of you for joining us today. Suzie and I embarked on a journey to write a new book that came out last summer. And since then, we've been talking about it and traveling around and meeting with folks, and really have enjoyed the interaction around the book. So we just wanted to say we hope that you will engage in a chat with us. It's hard being in a virtual environment, but send us questions, and we are going to probably have time for questions at the end, and maybe we'll be able to do that via open mic. The only other comment I want to make is that we wrote this book for two reasons. One is that we felt that progress on 21st century education and deeper learning had really migrated to using a portrait of a graduate in such a way, but that books had not really captured the success of that, and had also not captured an even more recent development, which is the creation of a portrait of an educator. So we will talk about both of those today. And then we felt that some of the competencies that haven't been receiving as much attention from communities, creative problem solving, civic engagement, and self-directed learning needed more attention. And we think our book did a good job of highlighting those issues. So that's the reason for the book. I'm really proud to have co-authored it with Suzie Boss, and we'll tell you a little bit about ourselves. Go ahead, Suzie.
Sure. So I'm a writer and educational consultant. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, but my adventures in education have taken me all around the globe, just about every continent except Africa, I think, working with educators, working with school systems, primarily around efforts to introduce project-based learning across the curriculum, across grade levels. This book was a wonderful adventure to take that conversation a little more broadly and engage with school leaders in the discussions about where school is going. And I was delighted when Ken invited me to share this journey with him. So Ken, tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to get this whole conversation going.
Well, some of you may know that in 2002, I launched the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, which was a collaboration between national education groups and education technology companies to try to articulate what were the competencies young people needed in the 21st century. And I ran that group till basically 2011. And at that time, two of my colleagues, Valerie Greenhill and Allison Nielsen, and I launched EdLeader 21, which was a group of superintendents around the country that were trying to implement 21st century education. And since then, that work, which primarily focused on the 4 C's of critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity, has morphed to the creation of a portrait of a graduate. And we did all of the districts involved in EdLeader 21 and the districts involved in EdLeader 21 today. After I retired in 2019, they are still focused on how do they bring a portrait of a graduate to life for their students.
Great. Okay, so our contact information is here. Feel free to reach out to us after the session. We'll share this again at the end. But we're going to tell you a little bit about kind of the story behind this book. You know, as Ken mentioned, he had a topic in mind. He was nearing the end of his work with EdLeader 21, but felt like there was more work to be done. Ken, if I can put some words in your mouth here, to broaden this conversation. So we really reached out to those school leaders and the school systems that were on the leading edge of transformation. Those who were really advancing this work of setting new goals for what students should know and be able to do by the time they graduate to be ready for the future. And we wanted to capture some of the lessons learned and kind of chart a way forward for districts who were just coming into this conversation in their communities. When we began the book, we had no idea. We began talking about it. We had no idea that a pandemic was on the way. We began thinking about the book toward the end of 2019. And once we got going, our research coincided with the pandemic. So all of our 200 and some interviews happened virtually. Ken and I weren't in the same room until the book was actually out in hard copy. We knew each other, of course, from the past, but we had to make use of virtual resources and learn how school systems were navigating the pandemic. And some of the lessons we learned along the way were that those who had been focused on this path of redefining student success were really better ready to navigate change and uncertainty because they had built a culture that allowed for that. And we'll talk more about some of those insights today. But the key things we wanted to focus on in our session today was to help you understand how the portrait of a graduate, as Ken introduced it already, becomes a new North Star for your school system, and that it arises from a big community conversation with your stakeholders. So that everybody's on board and it has a common understanding and consensus around how does our community want to prepare our students for the future. So we'll talk with you about that. We're going to also emphasize why creative problem solving needs to be a big part of your vision and what we learned in school systems that are emphasizing creative problem solving from elementary all the way through high school. What does that look like? And finally, we're going to introduce to you a new tool to bring students into this conversation. We know that this symposium is all about student-centered learning. And so we take that to heart, and we have a resource that we'll share with you at the end that will help bring students into the conversation with you. Ken, I'm going to shift to you.
Well, we just wanted to take a moment here to say, and I hope all of you on the call have the same sense, that given where education is today, given the crises it's in the middle of, given this COVID, I don't know whether to say we've come out of COVID or we're still in COVID, but what we've learned from this period, as Suzie says, is that parents, students, teachers, communities have really recognized that the system as it stands today, or the traditional system of content mastery and test taking, has not served us well in a way that I'm not sure was even understood as well prior to COVID. And so we're feeling, as a result of our interviews, as a result of the work we've done on the road since the book came out, that there among some leaders, there is a real sense of urgency that this redefinition of student success has to happen now. Now, I want to acknowledge, we'll both acknowledge, there are plenty that are looking in the rearview mirror and saying, well, COVID actually did two things. It made us realize that the system itself may be focused on the wrong goals, but it also emphasized that we're falling behind on the old goals. And so there's this twin tension that we're holding right now. Do we focus on the old goals and get ourselves up to speed on competencies that may not be as necessary for your student success? Or do we put in place a redefinition of student success that can really have students engaged in their own learning and working on things that are important, both to them, but also to their futures?
Great.
So we wanted to give you a couple of the interviews from the book that really sort of underscored for us this sense that we're really at a moment of needing pivotal change. And so many of the things that are now underscored, like global competency, not getting enough attention, interdisciplinary problem solving, not getting enough attention, and giving every student the opportunity to take on big challenges in which they're being asked to work on problems in their community, generally not being implemented. And so, one of the most interesting parts of the book was our interview with Daniel Pink, where we talked to him about his great book, A Whole New Mind. And we're actually astonished to remember that it was 15 years ago. And we said to him, well, how do you think we're doing? And he said, not so good. He said, I would have hoped by now that we really would have had more of a sea change in terms of working on the biggest challenges we have, that there was an opportunity to bring creativity to the biggest challenges in front of us. And neither the society as a whole nor our schools tend to be focused on those great opportunities for great thinking and novel thinking and innovative thinking. The other thing he said that was interesting to us was that when he wrote A Whole New Mind, he didn't even focus. He focused on problem solving, but not problem seeking. Or he was saying, how do we ask the right questions is now even more important than solving the problems, because with the advent of artificial intelligence and having so much data at our fingertips, the real issue is, what questions do we want to solve with that data? It's there for the asking, but do we know how to ask the right questions? And getting kids to focus on asking profound questions that will matter is something that I didn't even raise 15 years ago that now turns out to be critical. So this will give you some of the ideas of thought leaders in the field that continue to spur our thinking about why the timing for this new vision of education is now.
Great. Okay. So, you may be thinking, okay, what are some of these new competencies? And we'll get into some examples of how school systems are defining them. But when we look from a research perspective, what are the experts saying? We look to the World Economic Forum, and this is their list of what matters most in terms of job readiness skills. And this is 3 years from now, 2025. And if you look at these, you see analytical thinking at the top, being able to learn, recognizing that memorization isn't going to cut it, that it's about being ready and able to continue learning, solving complex problems and thinking critically, and on and on. You can see the list for yourself. These are many of the same skills that Ken in his work and the conversations he's been having, we've been talking about in education for 20 years, the 21st century skills that he mentioned before. They're all embedded in this list. And yet at the same time, we're just not making the progress that needs to happen. The quote that you see on the right is from a more recent study, taking a look at 21st century competencies globally. And that researchers ranked countries based on their pedagogies and their assessment strategies to help students develop and get good at 21st century competencies. And they found a real lack. No country was doing terrifically. The US was pretty far down on the list. And that there's this sense that we know where we need to go, but we're not doing what we need to do yet to get there. So I think that contributes to some of the urgency that Ken was talking about. And just as importantly, education leaders are really starting to make a strong case for helping our students become ready for whatever is ahead. This phrase of being life ready is one we're starting to hear. This quote is from Superintendents Alliance, a rather new group really focused on equity issues in education. These are some large urban district leaders who have formed this alliance, and they're really making a call to action for education leaders to get busy with this work of redefining student success. And they talk about a good place to start being local conversations about what children should know and be able to do before they graduate. And that goes right to the heart of what we're going to be talking with you about today, and right to the heart of what districts who are ahead of the transformation curve, the work that they've been doing.
So we wanted to share with you, before we show you some of the community examples and give you a website that features community examples from around the country. Suzie and I worked with a friend of ours in Rhode Island who is a wonderful cartoonist to help bring to life a starting point for the conversation. And we want you to see there is some of you will recognize the 4 C's in here, or 3 of the 4 C's: critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. And then we have added creative problem solving, civic engagement, and self-direction. And I want you to look at these for a moment. This is a poster, by the way, we'll show you at the end. You can have access to yourselves. It's at redefiningstudentsuccess.org, and you'll be able to download it and use this. But while we're in the conversation with you as a point of reflection, why don't you currently ask yourself a couple of questions about this poster that we've developed. One is, which of these competencies is your district currently working on, or your organization? Or if you're a teacher, which of these competencies are you focused on in your classroom? Which of these competencies is your district really emphasizing deeply? The second is, are there any of these, are there any competencies that you value off the top of your head that you would add to the list? And maybe you could put that in the chat right now. What is a competency that you think is really important that you don't even see on this list? And that would be helpful to hear from you. The idea here is that we're not generating the definitive list. We've tried to generate a list that can be a conversation starter for you. So you could bring this into your community, you could bring it to your leadership team, you could bring it to your organization and say, hey, this is a really solid starting point. How would we refine it? And that issue of refining is really important because communities need to own this process. And so the portrait of a graduate process that's going on around the country in hundreds of districts is really a process where communities get to look at a starting point like the 4 C's or about these success skills that we've put up and begin to have a broad-based community conversation around them. So let's show you a couple of examples of those. The first is from Mansfield, Connecticut. And here's a relatively simple one. This is a K-8 district, and this is their take on the 4 competencies for their district. And this has been deeply operationalized within the district. And they, as a community and as a teaching community, have embraced these as the focus beyond obviously state standards in Connecticut. And let's give you another example so you see that they're not cookie cutters. Here is another example. This is from Natick, Connecticut. There are some overlapping competencies, but there's some that aren't. And you'll see empathy and initiative and self-direction and resilience here that have been focused on. And so this is really a good, powerful example because we want you to see that no 2 districts are doing this identically. And but these are 2 very, I think, strong examples of portraits of a graduate. So why don't we, Suzie, I think you take it from here.
Well,
one more slide. Thank you. So I did want I didn't have it in front of me. One more piece of very important wisdom for all of you. If you've not been to the site portraitofagraduate.org, you'll find dozens of other examples. And I think it's very powerful to be able to see them from around the country. And again, I think it reinforces the fact that this portrait of a graduate is not supposed to be just some expert's portrait that you've adopted, but rather a portrait that the community has engaged in a broad conversation about and come to their own version of what words are important, what concepts are important for that community. And I think making it community-based and broad-based within the community can really help create longevity for this vision as a complement to state policy and state content standards. Having these competencies in place for your community can help create a much more holistic approach to what competencies all your students should have.
Great. Yeah. So if you would use the chat, Bailey, I see, has added a comment that their journey is about really the 4 C's. But we'd like to know, in your school system, which of these competencies are you focusing on right now in a really active way? You know, which one is really embedded in your instruction and in your assessment? Some districts we've talked with who have done the work that Ken just shared with you, the portrait of a graduate work, are creating look-fors, or, you know, what should we see if we walked into a 2nd grade classroom? What would critical thinking look like? Or by 8th grade, what is a civically engaged young person? What are they doing? And how do we know? What's the evidence that they're developing and mastering these competencies? How do they talk about their learning and their growth? What sort of goals do they set? So if we could take just a moment, if you're ready to use the chat, it would be great to have you add, just so we can get a sense of what's happening in the field. If these are important to your school system, you know, which ones really matter and how are you gaining traction? So we'll give you just a moment to add a little bit to the chat, if you would. We'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience.
It's a very shy group, Suzie.
And I know we're not getting not a lot of chat action here. We see a number of participants in the group, so we're happy to see you here. Maybe I'll continue talking. We'll keep going and hope that you'll catch up with us in the chat, because I think it's really important from one district to another to hear what's happening. That was one of the things we found in our conversations with folks as we were researching this book, that there's great value in connecting ideas from one school system to another and letting districts know, how are others going about this, or how have they overcome challenges in getting this conversation started. So please use the chat if you would. Great. Lori, I appreciate that. You're just getting started and not yet ready to share your insights. And Jen, as you're working on communication and collaboration, I'd love to know more about, you know, how are you doing that? What does that mean for students? What are they actually doing and presenting as evidence? Great. We're starting to see a lot more messages now. Terrific. Tony, doing that definitional work. Confidence is one of yours. Holistic, empathetic, really interesting. Okay. And in Ohio, the personalized learning network. Fantastic. Great. Okay. Student voice, community collaboration. Terrific. So you can see already, just in this little bit of chatting, quite a range of different focus areas. This is why this really needs to be a strong community-led conversation, because different things are going to matter in different communities. So keep those comments coming as we continue on. What we'd like to do is share with you a short bit of video. One of the school leaders we spoke with was Talisa Dixon, who's led the Portrait of a Graduate process in Columbus City Schools. She's the superintendent there. I'm going to share a little bit of video with you. The sound is not ideal, so turn your volume up loud. It's only 1 minute, so I hope you'll be able to get the gist of it. But as you're listening, pay attention to key words or phrases that really stand out to you, and we'll debrief those in the chat afterwards. So let's take a listen to what Talisa had to say to us about the process.
Was so overwhelmed with the community's response. So people, it was something different, and it wasn't a group of educators in a back room with just a few people talking about what are our hopes and dreams and aspirations for our students. So I think that part was refreshing, that, wow, it's going to be some new energy and synergy around this. If all means all, then if we're preparing all students for tomorrow, today, then we have to do that for all kids. And what are we talking about preparing them? Are we saying we're preparing them for work, or are we preparing them for the future? And that's a very different conversation. And I wanted to make sure that our message was, our students should be able to go to college, to work, the military. Is their choice, but they will be prepared.
Okay. I see Tammy already commenting, all means all. That was a phrase that really stood out to me as I listened to this. And then, Stephanie, I appreciate the shout out to my my PBL work. Appreciate that, and particularly the trait of curiosity. Fantastic. Yes, and Bailey noticing this superintendent thinking about what are those opportunities that our students want to pursue. We're not shoehorning them into the future that we imagine, but we want to have them prepared and ready to make choices. So I appreciate that, and I really appreciated this superintendent's emphasis on equity. That was a big focus in our work as well, because we felt like this conversation around preparing students for the future means preparing them to be ready for whatever they aspire to. And if we're not helping all students become ready, then we're creating not only achievement gaps, but readiness gaps. And we don't want those to happen for our students. We want all of them ready, as the superintendent says, to make the choices that they want to make for the future that they imagine. So I think her words are worth remembering, and she's one of the many visionary superintendents that we learned a lot from. Whoops. Okay, and then Ken, back to you.
Great. I just wanted to make one comment that might help you all who are beginning on this journey. Somebody made the observation that we have a lot of student voice and community collaboration going on in our district, which is fabulous. But I wanted to draw a distinction between describing approaches and describing programs and describing the actual student outcomes that become the goals of your system. So I'm totally, and we'll be talking more about student voice in a little bit, but student voice is a condition that we need. We need student input and student participation. But it isn't necessarily one of the competencies we're going to ask our students to aspire to. It's a strategy to help them get there. So I just wanted to, I just thought I'd offer that distinction. One of the other pieces that I think the book breaks some relatively new ground on is that if you're going to redefine student success for your students, if you're going to redefine success for your students, you have to redefine success for the other people in the system. It's not enough to just redefine student success for your students, because your teachers obviously have to redefine student success as well. Your teachers need to redefine success for teaching. What does success look like for teachers if they're enabling students to aspire to these new definitions of student success? So as we headed down that road, we talked to some districts that were doing some very interesting things in that regard. Suzie, can we go back to the Natick portrait of a graduate for a minute? It's just a few slides back right here. So I want you to recall that these were the competencies that Natick chose. But they had a really interesting conversation led by, of all people, the president of their local union, who said, these are great for students. We totally support these. But now that we have a profile of a Natick graduate, what is the profile of a Natick teacher? And I hope one of the neat takeaways from this session with you is to think about, because very few districts have done this, think about, should we have a portrait of an educator to complement our portrait of a graduate? So let's go back and see what Natick did, because they didn't, here we go, great. So they didn't completely mirror their portrait of a graduate. Some of these actually exist within their portrait of a graduate, but some of them don't, because they asked the question, what is it that our teachers need to be able to do to teach and assess our portrait of a graduate? And there's some things like building relationships, being empathetic, being collaborative, being a lifelong learner, being flexible and adaptable, being anti-racist and equitable, and have an equitable mindset. These are all the things that we think teachers need to be able to do in order to successfully support students on their portrait of a graduate journey. So
Right.
I find this very exciting. and to see one in action now. I want you to before we move on to creative problem solving, I want you to stop here for a moment and think about, what would a portrait of an educator look like? And this is, again, another list, another opportunity for us to go to the chat for a moment. If you were going to, now you don't have a portrait of a graduate, or you might, but several of you don't. But imagine you adopted the 4 C's, or adopted Suzie and my 6 success skills as your portrait of a graduate. Is there a competency you want your teachers to have that is not on this list? Why don't you just, if there's some ideas that pop up, why don't you add them to the chat? What would be a portrait of an educator competency that you think teachers would need to be able to successfully support students by way of pedagogy, by way of assessment, and other means for being successful in attaining their portrait of a graduate? Any thoughts?
While you're adding to the chat, I'd love to see your comments there. Questioning skills.
Oh,
great.
there's a good one. Yeah.
Let's also add, Ken, excuse me, that the portrait of an educator is typically developed by teachers, while the portrait of a graduate is an entire community stakeholder conversation. This is the work that educators really need to take on and own. And so we're seeing some great comments here. Objectivity, questioning skills, really important. One district.
I had one district I worked with in California where the teachers came up with 2 items that aren't on this list. Consistency, that's a good one. That aren't on this list. One of them was pedagogy to support the portrait of a graduate, which I thought was a really good one. And secondly, coaching. The ability to be a coach as opposed to just a lecturer. What does coaching look like? Which could be a subset of relationship building, but may not be. And then they also added technology. This was a district that was technology challenged and thought that technology strategy needed to be on this list as well. I will say to you that a union president who advocated this process for their teachers in this district felt that it was a journey that would get them towards a new evaluation process. And his whole point were, if these are the competencies that really are required for us to teach 21st century students, these should be used in the HR process. They should be used to hire. They should be used to recruit. They should be used to onboard. They should be used to evaluate. And clearly, they should be used as a focus of professional development. So I think you can get the idea. We were very excited about how powerful this portrait of an educator could become.
Right. And particularly around goal setting, that, as Ken is saying, these are great for hiring, but they're also great for saying these are aspirational, and these are the skills that we want to help you grow into as an educator. And we're going to find ways to support you in deepening your competencies as a lifelong learner yourself. So again, really powerful tools that are starting to emerge from the field. So let's shift to one of our favorite parts of the book, which is the focus on creative problem solving. And Ken's going to talk in a minute about why creative problem solving really rises to the top, kind of our own list of key competencies. But what I want to emphasize is, before we share some examples, we think this is, again, needs to be something that all students experience. And so the examples in the book, the middle part of the book, includes what we describe as field trips into places in the country where students are deeply engaged in creative problem solving. And we looked for examples that were not just little tiny subsets of the population, or a special group of kids got to do this one wonderful thing one time. We've all seen examples like that over the years. What we were looking for were examples where creative problem solving was really at the heart of the student learning experience. And we found amazing examples that we'll talk about in a little more depth But again, this is something that we think needs to be something all students develop. And I'm going to let Ken talk with you a little bit about how our thinking came together around emphasizing creative problem solving.
Well, thanks, Susie. As somebody who has advocated for the 4 C's for a long time, and I appreciate that one of the districts on the call is using the 4 C's as their starting point. As a starting point for this book, I actually got worried that the 4 C's were being used too narrowly. And that is that they were being shoehorned into narrow competencies or content areas so that people would look at the 4 C's and go, well, I'm going to take math and make sure that there's critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity in math. And then I'm going to do the same thing in English, and I'm going to do the same thing in science, and then I'll do the same thing in social studies. And basically, it was, is your math teacher in putting enough collaboration into their math? Is your social studies teacher putting enough creativity into social studies? And that is useful, but it isn't big enough vision of where we need to go, because the world, none of the problems, challenges facing the world exist in individual domains. They don't exist in content silos. They exist in big interdisciplinary contexts. And as you'll see in a moment, when Suzie and I talk about these great examples from the book, and I don't even know how we chose only 3. If they'd given us 2 hours, we would have done 10. But they're just some great examples. But what we found, one of the biggest lessons we find, is that math, even when you add the 4 C's, math, science, English, and social studies are being taught in a context that is producing compliance. Follow these rules and get to this outcome, which is mastery of content. Whereas all the problem-solving examples in the book were interdisciplinary by nature. If students wanted to solve a problem, a local problem, even if it was, we could explain this later if you ask, even if it was a traffic problem at the school, could be a serious traffic problem that led to a student death, or even if it were some kind of testing local water that we'll talk about. The idea that you were just going to do that in a STEM class or in a math and science class, but not marry it with the advocacy locally to bring that problem to the attention of local officials, which then requires you, in order to do something about the knowledge you found, which is really what problem solving is about, you then need to know, how do I take this math and science knowledge I've just developed and transfer it over to the realm of potential cooperation with local authorities, and how I can help them do their job better by providing them the STEM information that I've now gathered. So we came away feeling that if you want to really shift, and this is the reason we emphasize problem solving and self-direction in the book. If you want to move from a system that has compliant knowledge workers, which was the workers of the 50s and 60s, to a system that produces self-directed problem solvers, that we need to make sure that creative problem solving is at the top of the list, and that we're not going to settle for just tucking it inside one domain, because students won't be given the opportunity to really solve the problems that they're challenged by, that they're intrigued by, that they're compelled by, if we lock them into one topic at a time. They won't be able to solve those problems.
Okay, so let's look at a few examples. And as Ken's describing this process of problem solving, something that really emerged from our interviews was that students need to develop these competencies over time. They don't become effective problem solvers, creative problem solvers with one great project at the end of high school. They need to build this skill set and these ways of thinking and engaging with problems. One of our best examples of that came from a district in California, an elementary district called Encinitas in Southern California. And in this district, students are seen as real assets. The superintendent talks about if there's a problem we're experiencing as a district, we turn to our students first to help us figure out how can we go about solving this? How do we understand this problem better? So students in this community have done everything from work on very campus related issues. They got concerned about stormwater runoff and where does wastewater go? How can they keep pollutants from getting out of the nearby ocean? Because they care a lot about the ocean environment. And so they looked at their own campuses and thought about stormwater remediation, which doesn't sound like a great student interest. But once kids began looking for things that they could really tackle, this became a big passion of theirs and something they got really expert about. Same thing around becoming clients or taking on clients in the community and using their understanding of sustainability issues to help organizations like the local Y, where many of the kids had gone for classes, to help them get better on their sustainability efforts and to educate community members. So this is a great example of a district that builds students' abilities as questioners, as people, young people who can research, who can come together around solutions. And the image you see here is a wall from an outdoor experiential learning space that had been unused bus parking space. And the students turned it into this experiential learning center through this whole problem solving process and collaborating with architects to bring their vision to life. So that was a really inspiring one and underscored for me the importance of teaching students how to ask great questions and how to solve problems collaboratively.
Suzie, let's stay on that one because
Okay.
I can't help myself. We have one other elementary example that I just, because you guys deserve to hear this story if you don't end up reading the book. This was a group of the district decided that they wanted to create civic engagement activities. And their notion of civic engagement for first graders was to allow students to identify things in the environment of their school that they could improve. And this really goes in a big way to this issue that the whole conference is devoted to, which is student voice and student voice. This is a great example of student voice. So they say to the students, what part of the school would you like to work on? Which is something that you could contribute to? And the answer the first graders gave just blew the adults away. They said, we would like to improve the student orientation you give to kindergartners. What? We don't think you did a good job in your orientation for us last year because you scared us so much. And turns out there was no reason to be scared, but you didn't let us know that. And what we would like to do is rewrite the booklet you handed out, and we would like to give the orientation presentations because we think we can do a better job of calming the incoming kindergartners down about what they're going to face. I wish I could see all your faces, but every time I've told this story, people go, oh my goodness. It's such a great example of students being able to find problems that the adults wouldn't think of. And as it turns out, the students did a great job of addressing the very problem that they wanted to address, which is helping kindergartners be less stressed and less nervous when they started. So I couldn't help but throw it in. It's one of the examples that I'm most excited about, but it also, it'll go to this theme that I'm going to carry through with middle school students, which is we dramatically underestimate students' abilities to identify important problems and be interested in them and work on them. And just imagine the example I just gave you of all that the kids learned. They had to come up with materials. They had to learn how to present them. They had to write them in a booklet. They had to present the booklet to the students. I mean, these are unbelievably good academic opportunities for communications and skills of all kinds and critical thinking skills. But it's in a context that they cared about, and it's a context they were able to make a difference and to be civically engaged in the best sense of that term.
Fantastic. So let's move
Sorry,
on to
Susie. Sorry, Suzie. I
No,
couldn't
no
restrain.
apologies. We love that example. Let's move on to middle school, and Ken, take it away.
So this is another example where a sixth grader in middle school went to the local Lake Arbor, outside of Arvada, Colorado, and found out that the lake had been closed and he couldn't take his dog for a walk around the lake. And he went home and he said to his dad, "What's going on? Why is the lake closed? And what can I do about it?" And he said, "Well, let's go see your science teacher." This was sixth grade. "Let's go see your science teacher." And the science teacher said, "This is a really serious problem. I don't know what the answer to your question is." And by the way, this was like in June, I think, maybe. So it was the end of the school year. And I'm sorry?
Over the summer, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, right at the early summer. And she said, I think that this should be the problem that sixth grade students deal with next year. And I will approach the other science teachers and see if we can collectively turn the STEM activities for the sixth graders into a focus on this problem. They ended up getting help, reaching out to the City of Arvada Water Department, and asked if they would be aided by 205 citizen scientists from the sixth grade at the Arvada Middle School. And the teachers arranged, and the school district arranged, to take 205 students down to the shore and take samples of the water, come back to their labs, and each of them did their own scientific paper about what they found. What you're watching here, this photo, it looks like it's a choral presentation, but it's not. These are the students who are presenting the results of their research to the Arvada City Council. And the Arvada City Council went back to them and said, "We want you to work on potential solutions," which they started working on. But two things, there's so many parts of this story that we could elaborate on, but two things I want to focus on. One is we interviewed the teacher and the superintendent, and we said, "How did you know that you had the latitude to create on such short notice, 90 days notice, a course for 205 students to do this kind of problem solving and research?" And she said, "Well, the teacher said, I knew that I had a green light for experimentation and innovation around our portrait of a graduate from my principal." And the principal said, "And I knew I had a green light to experiment and innovate from my superintendent." And that's how this project went. One more point here. We said to the teacher, "How did you know all these strategies?" This, by the way, this was the answer that blew me away. "How did you know all these strategies to put together this complex a project and then get the kids to present it to the city council? How did you know how to do this?" And she said, "My College of Education at University of Colorado at Denver specializes in project-based learning for urban problem solving. And I had examples of this in my course of practice as a teacher. And so I actually was, and I don't think this exists in lots of colleges of education curriculum, unfortunately, but it's a great example of what a great College of Ed can do to prepare teachers for these kinds of fabulous teaching experiences.
Great. So that's middle school. Now let's think about high school. And I'm sharing with you a comment here you can read for yourselves from Superintendent Michael Matsuda in Anaheim Union High School District in California. He's really a prominent national voice for the importance of civic engagement with young people and civic education. And we showcase several examples from the Anaheim district where students led adults through sometimes contentious issues, problem-solving issues that had to do with things like replacing a mascot that harkened to the Civil War era and that students no longer wanted to represent them. You can imagine that some adults who were alumni of those schools didn't want to let go of that old mascot. But students went through the process of bringing their whole community to consensus, they were able to do that because every teacher, every social studies teacher in that high school had been through professional learning through something called the Democracy Project in California. This is a really nice example of how teachers need to be supported in developing these competencies that we want students to develop. So if we want kids to be able to really take the lead on issues that can be contentious sometimes, we have lots of examples of civic engagement issues that are not so hot button. Things like advocating for a new crosswalk or stop sign or safer paths to school, that sort of thing. Those also involve civic engagement. But in some cases, particularly in this current moment, just bringing up the idea of civic engagement can become controversial in some communities. So how are you going to help your teachers be ready to both seize the opportunities when they arrive to build students' capacity as young citizens? And how are you going to kind of have their backs as a school system to make sure they have the support that they need, to be successful in that. I'm reminded just on this topic of civic engagement, which we devoted a whole chapter to because we thought it was so important. One of the principals we talked to at a middle school in New York, Nyack, New York, reminded us young people don't become citizens at the age of 18. They're already citizens. They're just young. And so we need to be thinking again about building their capacity as citizens, as engaged citizens, informed, educated citizens, all the way through their learning experience. So these examples are just embedded throughout the book to kind of show what's possible if you set a goal, for example, for your district to prepare students to be active, engaged citizens. What does that mean for teaching and learning? How are you going to get your teachers ready? How are you going to get your students ready for those experiences? And we found that there are many right ways to get there. Once you have your goals as a community, then the next step is some really good backward planning, thinking about what do we need to have in place to help us reach those goals and to support our teachers in helping students reach those goals. So we looked at examples, some of my favorites, of course, like project-based learning. Ken's been a big PBL advocate over the years as well. We looked at how districts are in some places looking at career pathways or using portfolios and portfolio defenses, mastery transcripts, different kinds of assessments. Any of these strategies can be part of your game plan moving forward if they align with those goals. If you're really keeping in mind that portrait of a graduate as your North Star and thinking about how do we want students to be ready, what should they know and be able to do, and then just kind of stepping backwards thinking, okay, so by the end of high school, by the end of middle school, by elementary school, how do we make these right-sized goals? How do we help students navigate their process and do assessments that are meaningful and that help students demonstrate what they know and can do? And how do we help teachers be confident in supporting students all along the way? So that's a big topic. We could spend, again, a couple more hours talking about strategies to get there. But what we want to emphasize is that this need for alignment and coherence between what your goals are and what's happening in the classroom all along the way to get us there. And
So
Ken,
the last thing we wanted to do is to talk to you briefly about the student voice. I think we've done, if it's not too self-congratulatory, I think we just did a fabulous job of explaining to you what the role of students can be in education. We gave you an example of first graders who defined a civic engagement project on their own. We gave you an example of students as scientists based on a student inquiry about a lake that was dying. We gave you a great example of students who are actually solving contentious problems through civil discourse and using norms to try to come to consensus on difficult problems that the community finds intractable. But we also want to emphasize that in your processes, like when you actually gather a group to put together the portrait of a graduate, make sure that students are included in that. In fact, there have been some portraits of a graduate where students were some of the most important participants in the room. And I can think of one facilitation I did in Colorado where the adults started to bring a food fight from the community into the room about the portrait of a graduate. And one of the students got up and said, I think the adults just brought the wrong subject into the room, and we're here to work on a vision for education, and the adults should keep their food fight out of here. And got a standing ovation. So Suzie and I are big advocates of ways of making students at the center, not only of your portrait of a graduate process, but the implementation going forward.
Sure. And we just have a little time left, but we want to remind you that this engagement of students in the process, again, needs to be really broad and diverse. It can't be just kind of the usual volunteers or the kids that always are asked for, what's your opinion on this, or the student government leaders. You really want to reach across your school population. So are students engaged in clubs like the kids here in the upper left-hand corner? Are they engaged in working with their community? Is that what lights them up every day? Like the kids in the lower left who are working on a PSA video for their community, or the ones you just heard about on the upper right who were citizen scientists and working alongside community experts and scientists to solve a real problem. So you want to think about engagement broadly. If you have some engagement strategies to reach beyond and across your student population, please share them in the chat. But we want to just continue along here because we have some resources that we want to share with you. Ken, do you want to talk about our guides and where they can get these?
So sure. So you've already seen our success skill poster. These are the success skill poster is also translated, Suzie?
Well, it's in the middle of the student guides. It's the same content.
Right.
Yeah.
So you will find it's a success skill poster, but we have a student guide to 21st century learning and a parent guide to 21st century learning. And these are available in both English and Spanish. If you go to redefiningstudentsuccess.org, you will find these materials there. And we're very excited for you because there are not a lot of folks out there that have taken advantage of these, but we think that particularly the student guide and the parent guide may give you ideas of how to engage your students and your parents in this discussion, which we hope you find very useful. But they're 4-page guides. They look like this, so they're really nicely done by a friend of ours, an artist friend of ours, and we're very excited to share these with you. And particularly given the theme of this conference, we think the student guide to 21st century learning should be very helpful to you as a way of engaging your students in the conversation we've just been having with you.
And kind of walking our talk around student voice, we workshop these. We had focus groups of students help us develop these. So they have student voice throughout. We just have a couple minutes left. Are there any questions or comments about kind of what's ahead for you, your next steps to redefining student success, or questions you'd like to ask us? And we're going to invite you to turn on your mic and open mic, ask a question, or use the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to share our contact information again, because we'd love to hear from you if you have questions, if there are resources you're looking for, or folks you'd like to hear more about.